The 1970s changed television forever, and nowhere was this more obvious than in cop dramas. But some episodes crossed lines that networks couldn't handle. One episode killed a viewer who tried to copy what they saw on screen. Another got banned for showing addiction so realistically that the BBC called it dangerous. These are the cop drama episodes that were too raw, too honest, too brutal for reruns. Hawaii 5, O, Bored, She Hung Herself, 1970. McGarrett's most infamous case never saw the light of day again after one tragic night in January 1970. This episode featured a hippie character practicing a bizarre form of yoga that involved autoerotic asphyxiation, portrayed as some kind of meditation technique. Within weeks of the broadcast, someone in America tried to replicate the hanging method shown on screen and died. The victim's family sued CBS, and according to Leonard Freeman's widow, the network agreed to bury the episode forever as part of the settlement. Not only was it pulled from syndication packages, it was completely excluded from every DVD release. Even bootleg copies that surfaced online decades later couldn't change CBS's stance. The episode remains locked away in the vault, making it the only Hawaii 5-0 episode you literally cannot watch legally anywhere. Critics who've seen it call it one of the series' worst anyway, filled with dated hippie stereotypes and cringeworthy dialogue. But the real tragedy happened off-screen when fiction became fatal reality. Starsky and Hutch. The Fix, 1975. Hutch's most harrowing ordeal became television's most controversial addiction story. When a vengeful mobster kidnaps Hutch and forcibly injects him with heroin to extract information about his hidden girlfriend, David Soul delivered what many consider the finest performance on 1970s television. The episode showed every brutal stage of forced addiction: the kidnapping, the blindfolded injections, the violent withdrawal, and Hutch's complete physical and mental breakdown. It was so disturbing that the BBC banned it from all European broadcasts for nearly 2 decades. British fans wrote angry letters for years, demanding to see the episode that had been deemed too graphic for their screens. The ban wasn't lifted until 1999, and even then, it only aired after extensive warnings. What made it so shocking wasn't just the graphic depiction of drug use, but how realistically it portrayed addiction as a weapon of torture. Soul's performance was so convincing that viewers genuinely believed they were watching someone destroy themselves. The episode proved that when Starsky and Hutch wanted to get serious, it could hit harder than any other cop show on television. Kojak, Cop in a Cage, 1974. Telly Savalas faced his most unhinged adversary in this episode that pushed the boundaries of television violence. John P. Ryan played a deranged ex-cop who traps Kojak in a psychological warfare scenario that turned into one of the most brutal cat-and-mouse games ever shown on network TV. The episode featured graphic torture sequences, psychological manipulation, and a level of sadistic behavior that made censors uncomfortable. Ryan's performance was so intensely disturbing that it overshadowed even Savalas's commanding presence. The character wasn't just a criminal, he was a representation of what happens when law enforcement goes completely wrong. Several stations pulled the episode from their regular rotation after viewer complaints about the violence and psychological content. The torture scenes were considered too realistic and too prolonged for family viewing time. Even today, the episode stands out as one of the darkest hours in Kojak's run, showcasing a level of brutality that the series rarely matched. It proved that even a show known for its tough content could go too far for 1970s audiences. Starsky and Hutch, Savage Sunday, 1975. This episode's title became prophetic when it sparked real-world violence and nationwide controversy. The plot involved domestic terrorists planning a bombing campaign, but what made it truly disturbing was the realistic portrayal of how easy it would be to carry out such attacks. The episode aired just as domestic terrorism was becoming a genuine fear in America, and the detailed bomb-making sequences were considered instructional rather than entertainment. Several police departments complained that the episode provided a blueprint for actual terrorist activities. The realistic special effects and technical accuracy of the explosive devices were so convincing that law enforcement agencies worried it would inspire copycat attacks. Multiple stations pulled it from their schedules after the first broadcast, and it was heavily edited for syndication. The episode's most controversial moment showed the terrorists easily obtaining bomb-making materials and constructing devices that could level buildings. Critics argued that television had no business providing detailed instructions for domestic terrorism, even in the context of catching the bad guys. The episode became a case study in how realistic crime dramas could cross the line from entertainment into potential public danger. Hawaii 5-0, and I Want Some Candy and a Gun That Shoots, 1971. This episode became the center of a real-world tragedy when Baltimore police blamed it for inspiring a factory shooting. The plot involved a disturbed individual who goes on a shooting spree, and the realistic portrayal of workplace violence was considered too detailed and too instructional. Within months of the episode's broadcast, a similar shooting occurred at a Baltimore paintbrush factory, and police investigators claimed the perpetrator had been influenced by the Hawaii 5-0 episode. Unlike Bored, She Hung Herself, this episode wasn't permanently banned, but it was heavily scrutinized and frequently pulled from syndication packages throughout the 1970s. The controversy raised serious questions about television's responsibility when depicting realistic violence that could potentially inspire real crimes. Law enforcement agencies across the country began monitoring television shows more closely for content that might serve as instruction manuals for criminals. The episode's detailed portrayal of how someone could carry out a mass shooting was considered too realistic for entertainment purposes. Starsky and Hutch, Nightmare, 1976. The British authorities deemed this episode too psychologically disturbing for broadcast, banning it alongside The Fix and Murder Ward. The episode featured psychological torture, graphic violence, and disturbing imagery that went beyond what censors considered acceptable for television viewing. The plot involved a character trapped in a psychological nightmare scenario where reality and hallucination became indistinguishable. What made it particularly controversial was its realistic portrayal of mental breakdown and psychological manipulation. British censors specifically cited the episode's potential to disturb viewers with mental health issues, arguing that the realistic depiction of psychological torture could be harmful to vulnerable audiences. The episode remained banned in the UK for over 2 decades, with fans writing letters demanding its release well into the 1990s. Even when it was finally allowed to air, it came with extensive content warnings and was scheduled for late-night viewing only. Critics who saw it described it as one of the most psychologically intense hours of television ever produced. Starsky and Hutch, Murder Ward, 1977. This medical thriller crossed into horror territory with its graphic depiction of hospital-based murder and medical malpractice. The episode featured scenes of medical torture disguised as treatment, with realistic special effects that made viewers genuinely sick. British censors banned it for its graphic medical violence and disturbing imagery that they deemed inappropriate for television broadcast. The plot involved a killer using medical procedures as weapons, and the realistic portrayal of medical torture was considered too detailed and too instructional. Several medical professional organizations complained that the episode portrayed hospitals and medical procedures in a dangerously negative light. The episode's most controversial scenes showed detailed medical procedures being used to inflict pain and death, with special effects that were disturbingly realistic. Critics argued that it crossed the line from crime drama into medical horror, with imagery that served no purpose other than to shock and disturb viewers. The episode remained banned in multiple countries for decades. Starsky and Hutch, Bloodbath, 1976. This cult-themed episode pushed the boundaries of television violence with its realistic portrayal of ritual murder and religious extremism. The plot involved a murderous cult that used religious ceremonies as cover for brutal killings, featuring graphic ritual violence that censors found deeply disturbing. The episode's realistic special effects and detailed portrayal of cult indoctrination techniques were considered too instructional for television broadcast. British authorities banned it for its graphic violence and disturbing religious imagery, arguing that it could inspire real cult activity or religious violence. The episode featured scenes of ritual sacrifice, brainwashing, and mass murder that went beyond what was considered acceptable for family viewing time. Several religious groups complained that the episode portrayed religious practices in a dangerously negative and stereotypical manner. The most controversial scenes showed detailed cult recruitment and indoctrination techniques that critics argued could serve as a manual for real cult leaders. The episode was heavily edited for syndication and frequently pulled from broadcast schedules. Starsky and Hutch, Vendetta, 1977. This revenge thriller featured graphic violence and moral ambiguity that made censors uncomfortable with its sympathetic portrayal of vigilante justice. The episode followed a character seeking revenge for his family's murder, using increasingly violent methods that the show portrayed with disturbing sympathy. British censors banned it for its graphic violence and its sympathetic treatment of extra-legal revenge, arguing that it could inspire real vigilante activity. The episode's realistic special effects and detailed portrayal of revenge planning were considered too instructional for television broadcast. What made it particularly controversial was how it made viewers sympathize with the vigilante character, blurring the lines between justice and revenge. Several law enforcement groups complained that the episode glorified taking the law into one's own hands. The most controversial scenes showed detailed planning and execution of revenge killings, with the camera lingering on the violence in ways that critics found disturbing. The episode challenged viewers' moral assumptions about justice and revenge in ways that made authorities uncomfortable. Police Story, The Wyatt Earp Syndrome, 1974. Joseph Wambaugh's most controversial episode originally had a different title that NBC refused to allow. The network's Standards and Practices Department forced him to change The John Wayne Syndrome because they were terrified of the implications. This anthology episode followed a cop who saw his badge as a license to be a vigilante, living out Western movie fantasies on the streets of Los Angeles. The character believed he was a modern-day gunslinger, dispensing justice with his weapon instead of following procedure. What made it so disturbing was how it exposed the dark psychology behind some police officers who saw themselves as above the law. Wambaugh, being an ex-cop himself, knew these types existed, and he wasn't afraid to show them. The episode featured scenes of police brutality that were considered shocking for network television in 1974. Several stations refused to air it during initial runs, and it was frequently cut from syndication packages. Critics called it Wambaugh's most honest and most dangerous hour of television because it dared to suggest that some cops were just criminals with badges. Police Story, The Player, 1975. James Fiorentino starred in this undercover cop thriller that blurred the lines between law enforcement and criminality beyond recognition. The episode followed a detective who goes so deep undercover in the drug trade that he becomes indistinguishable from the criminals he's supposed to catch. What started as police work gradually transformed into genuine criminal behavior, raising questions about whether he was still a cop or just another dealer. The episode featured explicit drug use, graphic violence, and moral ambiguity that made viewers question who they were supposed to root for. Fiorentino's performance was so convincing that audiences genuinely couldn't tell if his character was still working for the police or had completely turned criminal. Several networks pulled it from rotation after complaints that it glorified drug dealing and police corruption. The episode's most controversial scene showed the undercover cop participating in a violent drug deal where innocent people were hurt, and his only concern was maintaining his cover. Critics called it too realistic and too morally complex for television audiences who expected clear distinctions between good and evil. Police Story, The Cutting Edge, 1976. Joseph Wambaugh's exploration of police psychology crossed into dangerous territory with this episode about a cop's mental breakdown under pressure. The realistic portrayal of police officers dealing with job-related stress, alcoholism, and domestic violence was considered too honest for television audiences. The episode featured graphic scenes of domestic abuse by police officers, showing how the stress of police work could transform good cops into dangerous individuals. What made it controversial was its unflinching examination of how police officers could become the very criminals they were supposed to catch. Several police organizations complained that the episode portrayed law enforcement in an unrealistically negative light. The most disturbing scenes showed realistic domestic violence perpetrated by police officers, with special attention to how their training and weapons made them particularly dangerous when they snapped. Critics argued that the episode was too realistic and too psychologically complex for network television. The episode was frequently pulled from syndication packages and heavily edited when it did air, with the most graphic scenes of police domestic violence completely removed. Police Story, 3 Days to 30, 1975. Ed Asner delivered a chilling performance as an aging cop on the verge of retirement who decides to settle old scores in his final days on the force. The episode's realistic portrayal of police revenge and vigilante justice was considered too controversial for regular broadcast. Asner's character systematically hunted down criminals who had escaped justice through legal technicalities, dispensing his own violent form of punishment. What made it so disturbing was how sympathetically the character was portrayed despite his clearly criminal actions. The episode raised uncomfortable questions about police accountability and whether some crimes deserved extra legal punishment. Several stations pulled it from their schedules after law enforcement groups complained that it glorified police vigilantism. The most controversial scenes showed the character methodically planning and executing his revenge with the same skills and knowledge he'd acquired as a police officer. Critics called it a dangerous fantasy that could inspire real police officers to take justice into their own hands. Police Story, Requiem for an Informer, 1974. This Emmy Award-winning episode was almost too realistic for its own good, showing the brutal consequences of police informant work in graphic detail. The story followed the murder of a police snitch and the investigation that revealed just how dangerous and morally compromising the informant system could be. What made it controversial was its unflinching look at how police departments used and discarded informants with little regard for their safety. The episode featured scenes of intimidation, torture, and murder that were considered extremely graphic for 1970s television. Several stations received complaints about the realistic violence and the moral ambiguity of using criminals to catch other criminals. The most disturbing scenes showed how informants were essentially sacrificial pawns in a larger game they couldn't win. Critics praised its honesty, but questioned whether network television was the right place for such a dark examination of police tactics. The episode was frequently cut or pulled from syndication because of its graphic content and controversial message about law enforcement methods. These episodes prove that 1970s television was willing to go places that would make today's networks nervous. They pushed boundaries, asked uncomfortable questions, and sometimes paid the price with bans and controversy. Some deserved to be pulled for being genuinely dangerous. Others were casualties of moral panic and network cowardice. But all of them show what happens when television gets too real for its own good. What do you think? Were these episodes too dangerous for television? Or were networks just being overly cautious? Should controversial content be banned to protect viewers? Or should adults be allowed to decide for themselves what they can handle? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know which of these episodes you think crossed the line.